the wonders.
Yes, Paul.
What guidance can you give to humanity at this time in history?
From which perspective, dear friend?
Not to perish in a third world war.
In order for humanity to not move towards a third world war, the leaders of the free world, and the European leaders, the American leaders, North and South America, and as well as certain Asian leaders, and Russia as well, must begin to recognize that the desire, the need for power will precipitate the movement towards a war. That oftentimes there is a struggle from an individual's ego's perspective to choose to create a perspective of power as a necessity to validate themselves. And that is what causes, in effect, the beginnings and in fact the middles of the constructs, basically the constructs of what leads individuals into conflict, and as a result of that, from one conflict to another, eventually war. It is oftentimes believed by leaders of these countries that a war can be contained, that a war itself can be limited and controlled. For after all, if they do not attack certain countries, do not attack after certain other countries, then the war is contained. But the difficulty with that concept is that as more and more ego is being infused into the conflict itself, more and more individuals will look to expand the conflict to satisfy their own self-ego perspective. In doing so, the conflict will expand. The present conflict that is going on in the Ukraine between Russia and the European Union, if you want to see it that way, or Ukraine itself. This is a conflict that is perceived as being controllable and manageable in order to gain an advantage from the Russians' perspective of power, dominance, property, and resources. When in actual fact, doing so simply moves the world closer to a point where those who would resolve against this type of conflict would stand up and say no more. And once that occurs, Russia will be embroiled into a war it does not want. Yeah, true. Presently, the Russian society itself, the economy itself, is being battered. And certainly they are a proud, proud people and will stand up against the aggressor. And it is Putin's idea himself that would, in effect, paint the Ukraine, the European Union, the Americas, the United States, as aggressors, where they themselves are not even aggressing. Well, of course, that is simply a message, isn't it? But it isn't a question of who started who and who started what. This is an aggression that is being fueled by ego. And until such time as the leaders of these countries recognize that their egos are not as important as the value and the benefit of their own citizens. It is the citizenry that is the vast natural resource of their country. Until they recognize that, they will always look to validate their own sense of power, their own sense of self-benefit through conflict. And conflict eventually does lead to war. As far as the Middle East is concerned, where presently there is a great deal of conflict between the Islamic State and the rest of the world. Again, this is being fueled not by necessity, not even by religious fervor. Religious fervor is being used as a guise for it. It is actually a grab for power by those individuals within the Islamic state that in effect are looking to create for themselves what they perceive an Islamic state itself, an area where fundamentalist Islamic perspectives can be followed. But it isn't as a result of a religious fervor or a religious belief here. They're doing this in order to gain power over people and resources and gain money. It is viewed by many individuals who lead the Islamic State that if they can themselves convince the followers of Islam to follow them, that they will eventually take over the world. And so the only thing really stopping them at this point is they don't have a clearly defined leader yet. Once they find a clearly defined, charismatic leader, the Islamic State itself will be very difficult to overcome, and it will plunge the world into a world war because of it. So right now, there's a clearly defined leader in Russia by the name of Putin, but there's no clearly defined leader in the Islamic State. And from that perspective, therefore, if Russia and the Islamic State got together, then you would find the world embroiled in a world war. And this would be a war that will harm so much of humanity. For, in effect, many of the previous nuclear devices are still available and would be used in this next war. Not out of necessity, but rather out of a perverse desire to force the free world to its knees.